spooky place.
Welcome back to the spooky place, where the stories don't just scare you, they mark you. They sink into your skin, curl around your thoughts, and fester in the silence of the night. Tonight, we gather around the fire, not for warmth, but for something far more sinister. A tale so chilling, so unnerving, that once you hear it, you will never truly be alone again. This story doesn't end when the video does. It lingers, it breathes, and if you listen too closely, it might just crawl its way in your nightmares and never leave. So sit back if you dare, but remember, some things, once heard, don't just haunt your mind, they claim it. The Wendigo's Call. It was supposed to be a weekend of laughter, campfires, and ghost stories. 6 friends, Mia, Jake, Ellie, Ryan, Sarah, and Chris, had driven hours into the dense, untouched forest to escape the noise of the city. The woods were ancient, with towering pines that seemed to scrape the sky, and a silence so profound it felt alive. They set up camp near a clearing, the fire crackling as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced like specters on the forest floor. The first night was uneventful, filled with marshmallows and tales of local legends. But on the second night, something changed. The air grew colder, and the usual symphony of crickets and owls fell silent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It started with a whisper. Mia was the first to hear it. She froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward the trees. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Jake asked, poking the fire with a stick. "It sounded like my name," Mia said, her face pale. "But it wasn't right. It was my voice, but wrong." The group laughed nervously, brushing it off as the wind or their imaginations running wild. But then Ellie heard it too, a faint, distorted whisper calling her name. Then Ryan, then Sarah. Each time, it was their own voices, but warped, as if filtered through some unholy distortion. "Okay, this isn't funny," Chris said, standing up. "Who's messing with us?" No one answered. The firelight flickered, casting grotesque shadows on their faces. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, coming from all directions. The group huddled closer, their breaths visible in the freezing air. "Let's just stay by the fire," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's probably just some weird echo or something." But then they saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long and spindly. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and its mouth was fixed in a grotesque grin that seemed too wide for its face. It moved with an eerie grace, its head tilting as it regarded them. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. It was their voices, but twisted, as if the thing had stolen them and corrupted them. The figure raised a bony hand, pointing at each of them in turn, its grin widening impossibly further. "Run!" Jake shouted, and the group scattered, their screams echoing through the forest. Mia and Ellie ran together, their feet pounding against the forest floor. The whispers followed them, growing louder with every step. They could hear the thing behind them, its footsteps unnervingly silent. They stumbled into a small clearing, only to find the figure standing there, waiting for them. Its glowing eyes locked onto theirs, and it whispered their names again, this time in a chorus of voices. Theirs, their friends, and others they didn't recognize. Mia screamed, and the figure lunged. Meanwhile, Jake and Ryan had taken a different path, but the forest seemed to twist and shift around them, as if it were alive. They found themselves back at the campsite, the fires still burning. But something was wrong. The flames were too bright, too blue, and the shadows they cast were wrong, too long, too sharp. The figure was there, standing by the fire, its grin wider than ever. "Where are the others?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It simply pointed to the trees, where Sarah and Chris emerged, their faces blank, their eyes glowing faintly. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking as if controlled by invisible strings. Sarah, Chris, Ryan called, but they didn't respond. They just stood there, staring at him with those glowing eyes. The figure whispered something, and Sarah and Chris lunged at Jake and Ryan, their movements too fast, too strong. The last thing Jake saw was the figure's grin, impossibly wide, before everything went black. Mia and Ellie managed to escape the clearing, but the forest seemed endless. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in a heap. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest was watching them. "We need to find the others," Mia said, her voice trembling. But when they finally made it back to the campsite, it was empty. The fire was out, the tents torn to shreds. There was no sign of Jake, Ryan, Sarah, or Chris. Just the faint sound of whispers, carried on the wind. As they turned to leave, they saw it again, the figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Its grin was gone, replaced by something worse, a look of hunger. It raised a hand, and the whispers started again, louder this time, more desperate. Mia and Ellie ran, but no matter how far they went, the figure was always there, just out of sight, its whispers echoing in their minds. They never found their friends. They never escaped the forest. And if you ever find yourself deep in those woods, you might hear them too, the whispers calling your name in your own voice. And if you're unlucky enough to see the figure, with its glowing eyes and impossible grin, don't run. It's already too late. The forest always gets what it wants. Mia and Ellie stumbled through the forest, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding like war drums. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse, thick and suffocating, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light filtering through the dense canopy, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. "We need to find a road, a house, anything," Mia said, her voice trembling. She clutched Ellie's arm, her nails digging into her friend's skin. "We can't stay here." Ellie nodded, but her eyes were wide, darting nervously from tree to tree. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mia froze. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, she heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something wrong. "Let's go," Mia said, pulling Ellie forward. They ran, their feet slipping on the damp forest floor, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The growl grew louder, closer, and then they heard it, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They burst into another clearing, and there it was. The figure, tall, emaciated, its glowing eyes fixed on them. But it wasn't alone. Behind it stood Jake, Ryan, Sarah, and Chris. Their faces were pale, their eyes glowing faintly, just like the figures. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking as if controlled by invisible strings. "Jake," Mia called, her voice breaking. Ryan, what's happening to you? The figure raised a bony hand, and the other stopped. It tilted its head, its grin returning, wider than ever. It whispered something, and the others began to move again, slowly, deliberately, toward Mia and Ellie. Run! Ellie screamed, and they turned, bolting back into the trees. The growl was behind them now, louder, more frantic. They could hear the others following, their footsteps unnervingly silent. They ran until they couldn't run anymore, collapsing against a large tree. The forest was silent again, but the air was thick with tension. Mia looked around, her heart pounding. We need to hide, she whispered. Ellie nodded, and they crawled into a hollow beneath the tree's roots. They huddled together, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide with fear. The growl was gone, but the whispers had returned, faint and distorted, calling their names. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then they heard it. A voice, clear and familiar. Mia? Ellie? Is that you? It was Jake's voice. Mia's heart leapt. Jake, she called, starting to crawl out of the hollow. Ellie grabbed her arm. No, Mia, don't. It's not him. But it was too late. Mia crawled out, and there he was, Jake, standing a few feet away, his face pale, but his eyes normal. He looked scared, but alive. Mia, thank God, he said, his voice trembling. I thought I was alone. Where are the others? Mia hesitated, her heart pounding. Jake, what happened to you? We saw you with that thing. Jake's face fell. I don't know. I remember running. And then, nothing. I woke up alone. Please, Mia, we need to find the others. Mia took a step toward him, but Ellie grabbed her arm again. Mia, don't. Look at his shadow. Mia froze. The moonlight cast Jake's shadow on the ground, but it was wrong. It was too long, too thin, and it didn't move when he did. It was the shadow of the figure. Jake's face twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes glowing faintly. You should have run, he whispered, his voice distorted, echoing with the voices of the others. Mia screamed, and the figure lunged. Ellie pulled her back, and they ran, the forest twisting and shifting around them. The whispers were everywhere now, a cacophony of voices, all calling their names. They could hear the others behind them, their footsteps unnervingly silent. They burst into another clearing, and there it was, the figure, standing in the center, its grin wider than ever. Behind it stood Jake, Ryan, Sarah, and Chris, their faces blank, their eyes glowing. Please, Mia begged, tears streaming down her face. Let us go. The figure tilted its head, its grin never wavering. It whispered something, and the others began to move again, slowly, deliberately, toward Mia and Ellie. Ellie grabbed Mia's hand. We have to fight, she said, her voice trembling but determined. We can't let it take us. Mia nodded, and they turned to face the figure. But as they did, the forest seemed to come alive around them. The trees twisted and groaned, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground beneath their feet shifted, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The figure raised a hand, and the other stopped. It tilted its head, its grin widening impossibly further. It whispered something, and the others began to move again, their limbs jerking unnaturally. Mia and Ellie backed away, but the forest was closing in around them. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices, all calling their names. The figure lunged, its glowing eyes fixed on them, and then everything went black. When Mia opened her eyes, she was alone. The forest was silent, the whispers gone. She looked around, her heart pounding. "Ellie," she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She was alone, but as she turned to leave, she heard it, a faint whisper calling her name. She froze, her heart pounding. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and then she saw it. The figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, its grin wider than ever. And behind it, standing in the shadows, was Ellie. Her face was pale, her eyes glowing faintly. She raised a hand, and the whisper started again, louder this time, more desperate. Mia screamed, but no sound came out. The figure lunged, and everything went black again. And if you ever find yourself deep in those woods, you might hear them too. The whispers, calling your name in your own voice. And if you're unlucky enough to see the figure, with its glowing eyes and impossible grin, don't run. It's already too late. The forest always gets what it wants. Mia woke to the sound of birds chirping, the faint warmth of sunlight filtering through the trees. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. The figure, the whispers, the glowing eyes. But as she sat up, her body aching and her clothes torn, she realized the forest around her was unfamiliar. The trees were too tall, their bark too dark, and the air was heavy with a silence that felt unnatural. She was still in the woods, but not the same woods. This place felt older, darker, as if it existed outside of time. She called out for Ellie, her voice cracking, but there was no response. Only the faint echo of her own voice, bouncing back at her in a way that made her skin crawl. As she stumbled to her feet, she noticed something carved into the tree beside her. A symbol, jagged and crude, etched deep into the bark. It looked like a spiral, but twisted, as if it were alive. Beneath it were names: Jake, Ryan, Sarah, Chris, Ellie. Her heart sank as she realized her own name was being carved into the wood, the bark splintering, as if an invisible hand were etching it in real time. She backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder. They weren't just calling her name now. They were speaking in fragments, pieces of conversation she'd had with her friends. Laughter, arguments, secrets she'd never told anyone. The figure emerged from the trees, its grin wider than ever, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Behind it stood Ellie, her face pale and blank, her eyes glowing faintly. She raised a hand, pointing at Mia, and the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices all screaming at once. Mia turned to run, but the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees twisted and groaned, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she fell, her hands sinking into the cold, damp earth. The figure loomed over her, its grin impossibly wide, its glowing eyes burning into hers. It whispered something, a single word that echoed in her mind. Mine. And then, everything went silent. The forest is quiet now, as it always is. The campfire is cold, the tent's abandoned. If you were to walk through those woods, you might find the clearing where it all began. You might see the symbol carved into the tree, the names etched beneath it. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whispers, faint, distorted, calling your name in your own voice. But don't stay too long. Don't let the silence fool you. The forest is always watching, always waiting. And if you see the figure, tall and emaciated, its glowing eyes fixed on you, its grin impossibly wide, don't run. It's already too late. The forest always gets what it wants, and it's always hungry. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.